Welcome to the Dark Ozarks. We are discussing monsters. From the British Isles to the Ozarks, monsters from the Celtic past are roaming around the 21st century. We will get back to that in a minute, but first we want to remind you that the Dark Ozarks podcast is now available on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, Substack, or about any other podcast platform. So, what monsters would the Celts recognize in today's Ozarks?
I think there's a really good chance they would recognize a lot of them, from the old gods to mischievous supernatural beasts to monsters of a more mortal kind. And there are a few familiar faces right here in the Ozarks, and yeah, much to my dismay, we're looking at you, Howler.
We will return to what might be hiding in the dark or under your bed. But first, we want to invite you to like, follow, and subscribe to the Dark Ozarks on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Substack, as well as your favorite podcast platform. We also invite you to become a Dark Ozarks subscriber on Facebook. On the Dark Ozarks Facebook page, click subscribe, have your login information ready, and join Dark Ozarks behind the scenes for only $4.99 per month.
Your $4.99 per month subscription allows you to come with us on paranormal investigations, deep dive research, and topics too controversial for public view. The next 100 subscribers will be entered in a drawing for a free Dark Ozarks t-shirt and an exclusive signed first-run copy of the book Dark Ozarks: The Spooklight. Subscribe today to be entered in the drawing.
And now you can get Dark Ozarks t-shirts for sale at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com.
We encourage you to check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, in person and online, on Facebook and at the website alwaysbuyingbooks.com for all of your reading needs, including a large section on the paranormal, history, and more. Not to mention, the building is haunted. Tell Bob and Elise that we sent you.
We also want to thank Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri. Beard Engine Brewing is the only English-style brewery in Missouri and has been twice named Missouri's best brewery by the Missouri Brewers Association. Great beer and great food in a historical building with a noir past. And yes, their building is also haunted. Tell Nate and Tiff that we sent you.
Oh, we have
monsters. Yes.
Obviously it's an exciting, it's a fun subject. The Ozarks have an interesting number of monsters, and an interesting number of those monsters do appear to have ties back to the old world. I'm not sure where exactly we want to start. There's a lot to play with in our compendium of critters.
Well, I mean, we just got through St. Patrick's Day, so perhaps we start with leprechauns.
Oh, the thing that really jumps out to me, besides the Lucky Charms cereal, which I just had some. That was how I celebrated my St. Patty's Day. I had Lucky Charms cereal.
There you go.
But I think that the motif, I'm going to refer to as a motif initially before we dig into the actual lore, but the motif of the Irish leprechaun is likely the most accessible idea for pop culture and for everyday people who are not familiar with Irish folklore or Irish mythology, or the larger Celtic mindset. And honestly, we have the cereal to thank for that. We all grew up with the Lucky Charms leprechaun is a backdoor into eating some sort of extremely strange processed grain cereal with small dehydrated marshmallows. that really bears no resemblance to anything Irish, but it's still the idea. Leprechauns guard the pot of gold. They're tricky, quote unquote mischievous, and they're also interesting because they clearly have fairy qualities, but on the upside, even the caricatures of leprechauns do not fit the Tinkerbell stereotype. The leprechaun is male. He's quirky. He acts very differently than the classic idea of fairies, and yet he has these weird magical powers, which clearly are fae. So I think even in just the subconscious and just in the popular culture mindset as well, there is a hint of getting our minds shifted around the magical fae, of which Ireland, Scotland, Wales, the Celtic subcultures and the Celtic cultures that ultimately influenced the Appalachian folklore and the Ozarks folklore. It's being hinted at.
Yes, yes. And something a lot of people probably aren't aware of is that going back into the lore, it's not as clear whether the leprechaun is the mischievous but rather harmless creature, or whether there's more of a malevolent side to him.
And that's
go ahead.
I was just gonna say that's very appropriate when you begin to play in the pantheon of Irish mythology, is that these beings are extremely ambiguous in their presentation, and sometimes they are malicious, and you don't really ever know which one you're going to get.
Very true. And I guess a side note too is that a lot of people would associate with the leprechaun the phrase "the luck of the Irish,"
Yeah.
mainly from advertising and so forth. But that actually has nothing to do with the Irish lore, and it actually comes out of the West California, and it was actually kind of an insult that the Irish immigrants usually were down on their luck, etc. So having the luck of the Irish kind of meant you were down and out, and not that you really were lucky, or that the friendly elf brought luck.
Very, very true. Now there's an interesting side that I want to jump into because it does have a tie to some of our reports in the Ozarks. Currently, we can't disclose location, source, etc., but it is a first person source of an individual who saw not quote unquote a leprechaun, but in the old world there is an entire subcategory of supernatural beings that appear as old men.
Yes.
And appear as small old men. And if you listen to the reports, and I find it really interesting because we have folklore on this subject that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. And yet we relegate that into the category of fairy tale, folklore, bedtime story. What did someone imagine might be cool or creepy or interesting to put in their story? Let's have a little old magic man who's literally little, like anywhere from a few inches tall to just maybe a foot or two tall, and but clearly not a what we would think of as a small person. This is
right.
Differently proportioned, typically with, and also very notably appearing old. Now, there are they that appear radiant and beautiful and ageless. Think Galadriel from Lord of the Rings. But then this is clearly very different. And sometimes, and they're often in, particularly in English and Scottish lore, they are oftentimes referred to as elves, as an elf man, as sometimes as an elf woman. I remember one report referencing being on a hillside and just having the sense that everything changed and couldn't quite describe how or explain how it changed, but they simply knew it had changed. And they saw this couple. It was a diminutive, elderly couple dressed in strange clothes, studying him, and then they were gone. And oftentimes they're quizzical. They seem to be very curious. They seem to have some sort of power, and that also seems to be the experience that many times when someone encounters something of this nature, they know they're in the presence of a being that has some sort of gravitas and some sort of power that is otherworldly. It's very oftentimes unsettling in rare instances that it occurs. And I know we can't disclose a lot about it because it's still very private, but at least one report of an individual seeing one of these beings in the Ozarks when they least expected.
Yes. And so, and I think since we can't give out too much, I think it's important to note that these things are not just relegated to centuries old lore and lands, that these kind of experiences do happen actually around the world in this day, and really with pretty much all of the types of monsters that we're going to talk about today.
Yes, and I suppose the leprechaun might, or the little people, or whatever you want to call them, might take issue with us putting in the monster category, but it is an otherworldly, an out of place experience, and as is noted, all we can really say on this particular report is it is credible.
Yes.
And that you guys get to take our word for it. But it is, and there are, and we've talked about this at length in a couple of other episodes, but a number of First Nation peoples, the Cherokee come to mind, have long histories of interacting with beings of this sort. And it is a good lead in, and it is also very very mind-bending, I think, if you try to logic it out, because these beings, these individuals, whatever it is that they are corporeal. They're not a ghost. They're not a phantom. They leave footprints. They walk through dirt, and they walk through, in the case of the boot prints in my grandfather's garage, the boot prints, hobnailed boot prints in the sawdust. They sometimes interact. They seem very human-like in some categories in terms of experiencing human-like emotions and curiosity and interest. Sometimes appearing to be afraid, sometimes very much not appearing to be afraid, and yet they exist slightly out of shift with time.
Yes, and so a little in column A, a little in column B, that something of the other realm, of something supernatural, as well as something physical, and tied, at least part of the time, tied to the physical world.
And something that is also notable that I find very fascinating, but also a little bit unsettling, they seem to in some way be tied to a type of time or place. Often when someone reports seeing one of these people, they they're described as having very human-like clothing, only very old-fashioned.
Yes, like out of time. Yes.
Yeah.
Um, and almost like seeing someone in period clothing, but in miniature.
And there is additionally a strange obsession with shoes.
Yes, yes. Known to steal shoes, replace them,
Make new
practical
ones.
jokes, make
Lots
new
of
ones.
we could do probably an entire episode on European shoe lore, but it is very eye-opening when you begin to collect and sometimes receive credible first person stories of this nature. It really begins to shift one's perspective about not only just folklore, but about fairy tales in general.
Mm-hmm.
Begins
It
that
does.
just the shifting process, and for better or for worse, it really begins to change the way that you look at the world around you.
That's true. And actually, I was just thinking as you were talking about the shoe lore, um, actually, not very far from my house, there's a um, telephone wire that goes across the street that, as long as I can remember, years and years and years, someone has always tied two shoes together and thrown over that wire. And it's not the same shoes, and it's always a new looking pair of shoes. They never get very old. And I've chuckled to myself before. I'm wondering if that is a warding off of leprechauns or something, or an offering to them. I'm not sure which,
Yeah,
because it's not just
on
one
purpose
at a time.
or very it would be interesting if some of the more modern um practical jokes, urban legends, and customs not only have a basis in more ancient lore, but in some cases might actually act as sacrificial offerings.
Yeah, I've wondered about this because it goes back decades, always in the same spot. And so someone keeps sacrificing shoes. So
There's a leprechaun-esque entity, and on our notes it's way at the back on page 38. But I want to get your thoughts on the red cap, primarily because he appears to be Scottish, and as appropriately holds with supernatural beings of Scottish lore, everything, and we do mean everything, will try to kill you.
yeah, Scotland's kind of like Australia.
It is. It really is. Only colder, and I'm good with that.
A damper.
And I'm good with that. I really am. Great tea,
Hmm.
good whiskey, excellent shortbread.
We are known for a few things.
Yes, yes, and mm, but
I mean, um,
I I find it interesting. You know, the red cap is referred to as a murderous goblin.
yes. Well, and the red cap is because he soaks his cap in the blood of victims. Um, I mean,
That that's cheery.
and he's described with prominent teeth, skinny fingers, talons like eagles, fiery red eyes. All of these things, to be perfectly honest, it evokes vampire lore to me. Um,
That's a good point.
in the depiction. Um, and but then he has some traits that are almost like dragon lore. I mean, um, inhabits ruined castles, and it just oh, and then of course he can be driven away with scripture or brandishing a crucifix, um, and will vanish into flames. I mean, if that doesn't evoke Bram Stoker, I don't know what does.
That is very true. And that's another thing is we are beginning to delve into Celtic beings and beasties that there is an innate shapeshifter quality about many of these beings in terms of how they manifest themselves. They could appear short, they could appear tall, they could appear giants, they could appear as tiny winged beings. And for all we know, it might be manifestations of the same thing.
Exactly, and a parallel, a modern parallel, would be actually in ghost hunting. Um, with shadow men particularly, and apparitions to a degree anyway. Uh, um, a lot of lore, as well as a lot of people encountering entities now in real time, will discuss that either their form will change from one time to another or during an experience, or that their form will be exaggerated. The shadow men are a good example, that often they appear extremely tall, um, taller than human form, and no one really knows why. Um, and and actually, at the John Weiss house in Joplin, there's video that was caught of a shadow man walking um, through the parlor and down the hallway, and where he comes, the top of the shadow man comes in relation to the uh, the doorways, measuring, it would put him at just about 9 feet tall.
Wow. That is
So
fascinating.
so I, we don't call them monsters, or these kind of, not necessarily in the same sense of these grotesque characters, and grotesque in the classical sense of the word, but we still talk about that same kind of behavior and appearance shifting, um, in in ways that we would not associate with traditional lore.
Agreed on that. And in that regard, it's interesting. There are some very corporeal shape shifting stories and lore, and some of our beasties tonight will cross over into that realm. But in others, it is non-corporeal in the sense that these beings seem to exist only peripherally associated with our dimension, and
Right.
and can and do manifest themselves in very strange ways. In some cases, as you mentioned, elongated in
Mm-hmm.
a way that honestly it's easy to find very unsettling.
It, not necessarily appearing at the time in the manner they did at death, but instead, maybe a younger version of themselves or a stylized version. Um, so this notion of shifting appearance comes through in various ways in a lot of different aspects of these things. But I think the red cap, where the leprechaun could be debated about, is he a true monster? I think red cap fits more square um in that category. And he's referred to as a goblin, but I mean, in some ways, it could be a type of fae. It could be almost a vampire, or just a shapeshifter changeling.
True. Uh, it to me it's fascinating because we do there is a great deal of ambiguity associated with the nature of many of these. Are they
Yes.
and of course we ask ourselves, are they good? Are they bad? Are they and for individuals, and I know it's easy to get focused on the box with the cereal box with the leprechaun on it and go, oh, that's funny.
Mhm.
But you and I have both had experiences where, say, an individual has asked us to come in for an investigation, etc., perhaps for poltergeist activity, for odd things happening, and they're genuinely scared, and they're like, "What is here? Is it good? Is it bad? Does it mean us harm?" And so you shift a little bit into that perspective, and those questions have resonated, probably for for as long as human beings have been interacting with phenomena that appears sentient, sometimes corporeal, sometimes non-corporeal, and we're wondering: is it aware of us? Does it like us? Does it not like us? Does it mean us ill will? Is it there for positive reasons? Does it just not care? Uh, these are genuine questions that we have people ask us. So it's, for me, even though it's easy to sometimes dismiss, oh, that's a fairy tale, that's funny. The human need for answers when you're being presented with this sort of thing is very real, and I respect that.
Yes, definitely. I agree. Something that I've just recalled here too, with Red Cap, is that, um, which is kind of interesting with that notion of talking about people asking for help, is that, um, they're believed to have been basically a red cap at any ruined tower. Um, so that, basically one of these beings would be at any abandoned ruined castle or tower, which kind of opens the possibility of the the urban explorer going into the abandoned house, the abandoned, um, mansion, and having a less than friendly encounter with something. Is it a little more universal that there is a red cap kind of entity at abandoned places or abandoned buildings?
I think that's a really interesting observation, and it really does begin to shift one's perspective a little bit. And this began really when I started the process of opening myself up to the potentiality of, for example, the presence of elementals, the idea that some hauntings and some sentient hauntings aren't ghosts.
Right. And that is very much, in my experience, a possibility. And I think I've encountered a few of those where, yes, you're dealing with a sentient presence, but it's not human, never was. But we're not talking of, the evil, demonic sort. It's more related to place, and that would make sense to me. Another interesting aspect of Red Cap is that, he can have magical powers, just
Right.
flat out, including, as written by none other than Sir Walter Scott. in the minstrelsy of the Scottish border, he records a ballad that originally was written by John Leyden, called Lord Solus, in which Redcap grants his master safety against weapons and lives in a chest secured by 3 strong padlocks, which almost gives it a genie in the bottle quality.
It does. It does. There is the playing with fire aspect of that as well. The idea of the conjuring on a leash that often does not turn out so well.
Exactly. So, I mean, Redcap could literally be one of those that is hard to put in a box. That is it spirit? Is it fae? Is it vampire? Is it shapeshifter? Is it magical? It may be yes.
It may be yes. And I want your opinion on this. A certain aspect of Redcap lore may have also been colored by English chroniclers attempting to sortie into an inhospitable Scotland and getting killed.
Well, I mean that's possible. Although the lore seems to be Scottish itself, but I could certainly see the English kind of buying all into it, and these horrible things as almost to engender sympathy for their losses. I mean, it's possible, and it, or at least be spun as far as perhaps Redcap represents fighting the Scots. Period.
That's true. Very, very true. And with a reputation like that, certainly it's good psychological warfare on this side of the Scots to promote that.
That's true. I wanted to just also on page 39, I wanted to go into just a little bit about Barghest.
I find the Barghest really, really powerful and fascinating.
And with, I would say, direct ties to the Ozarks.
That
I guess
really jumped out to me.
Yeah. I think first of all, should we say with Redcap, I mean, there are things that are experienced in the Ozarks that have qualities that are incorporated into Redcap, such as the appearance and that kind of thing. And there are cases that seem to be thought form, etc. I mean, if you want to get literal with it, being driven away by scripture and the crucifix, the exorcist case happened here. I mean, so there are so many things that different stories that could be tied to that, but Barghest, I think, definitely can.
100%. And the Barghest is Northern English, particularly Yorkshire folklore of what's described as a goblin dog, a monstrous goblin dog. And anybody, I think, practically would recognize this is a great spectral hound. But in the case of the Yorkshire lore, it is quite specific, and it does begin to cross those. It existed in intersection between ghost, omen, goblin, elf. There's a lot. It's a lot of things at once.
Yes, and an interesting note that on the Northern English side, Barghest basically is the beginnings of the word ghost.
Correct.
Um, and actually then a hybrid with that, with the German, you end up with things like poltergeist, etc. So this is sort of the origin word for ghost that we're so familiar with. Now on the Scottish side, it was booger for bogart.
Yeah.
A bogart was the ghost.
And for folks here in the Ozarks or in North America, et cetera, who are not terribly familiar with York and the city of York and Yorkshire, we're talking about an area in northeast England, near Scotland, obviously, and during, up until, well, the from about, I'm going to spitball here, but beginning with the Viking invasions at around 8900, it was a Norse kingdom. And
yes, at times, yes.
Immediately prior to the Battle of Hastings, it was a Norse kingdom until King Henry and the English army defeated the Vikings, and then sustained a 2-week forced march from Yorkshire to the south of England, just in time to lose the Battle of Hastings to William the Conqueror.
Yes.
And
that march is attributed to a factor in the battle.
It is, because they were worn out when they got there, and had the reality was that they had just sustained an extraordinary victory in terms of defeating the Norse and York, and even to this day, in terms of influence, Nordic influence or Viking influence in the way that the English language is used, the way that the Yorkshire dialect developed, and many elements of the history are heavily influenced in that particular region. And so as a result of that, I find it really interesting, and I wonder how much the Barghest may also have been influenced by Norse and specifically Viking lore, as well as tales of which we might be unfamiliar, but it reminds me of the Odin's Wild Hunt. It reminds me of Fenrir, and especially notable in warrior cultures, shifting away from some of the later years of peasant cultures being impacted by plague, but instead warrior cultures who were surrounded by and constantly exposed to the reality of death. The idea of a death omen seems to be particularly appropriate.
Yes, and that certainly comes out in the Ozarks, and even in some of the incarnations of the stories from Yorkshire, that you see that there's a legend of the Trollers Gill, where a man ventures forth to the horrid gill of the limestone hill in order to summon and confront the Barghest in an act of ritual magic. And so basically something that, a beast that apparently they felt needed to be dealt with that harshly. The man's lifeless body was discovered soon. With inhuman marks.
He did not have the mojo he was hoping he had.
No, and there's also a story of the Barghest entering the city of York occasionally, and it preys on lone travelers. There's other places in the area bearing its name associated with it. And then in the 1870s, there's a story of a shape-shifting Barghest who said to live near Darlington and said to take the form of a headless man who would vanish in flames, a headless lady, a white cat, a rabbit, a dog, or a black dog. And this is really kind of getting two tales in the Ozarks of what are commonly called booger dogs, but definitely a lot of similarity. And of course, booger dogs are also known in Scottish lore, and often in the Ozarks, as with the Barghest, they can be omens of death. And in the stories here, there are quite a few that come out of the Civil War, of omens of death with the phantom dog or phantom hog, that can also be headless.
It can. And in the aspect of the death omen, it does seem to have some sort of incredible power.
It does. And certainly, at least during, and I imagine in Yorkshire too, that the idea of the death omen probably took root during some of the battles. I mean, in if you're not familiar, you had battles going back to the Norse invasions. You had with the Normans, the War of the Roses. It is. York saw a lot of war and sacking, including by the Scots during the fight for independence in the early 1300s. So time and again, it's not surprising that they would have death omen stories, and in the Ozarks, they kind of came out pretty much the same way during the Civil War. Soldiers would say that seeing a phantom hound or hog, and they would be described as larger than natural, often headless. And if it was headless, it was even more ominous as a death omen, that they would die in battle. It would happened enough that it was given credence.
And there's several things that really come to mind on these subjects. One, and of course, we're to a degree we're contributing to this pop culture milieu with our own publications, online. But I watch a lot of videos on this subject, as you know, because I send them to you.
Yes.
And
and then I watch them.
Yeah, and I love it. I love the genre. I love the interest. I love digging into these sorts of things. But something that I have really noted in the proliferation of this information in, say, the past 15 years, is that there is often because of the nature of the internet. Now, we're fortunate enough to be able to do long format and dig into these things, and I love long format podcasts across the board. But many of the things that we have on the internet, if it's an article, it's often 1,200 words or less. If it's sometimes it's just a short paragraph and you scroll through images. Oftentimes, if it's a video, it's introductory videos, 10 minutes long. The top 10, fill in the blank, so devoting about 1 minute, oftentimes with some fun, unique, contemporary graphics, contemporary images, sometimes AI art, which is a little odd. Not typically a fan of that. But this sort of cottage industry of lore, internet lore, or lore that is being presented on the internet that's about 1 million miles wide and about 1 inch thick. And it isn't, I'm not saying that it's meaning to, but one of the end results is it gives the impression of superficiality. It gives the impression that there's little interesting tidbits, but you're not getting the sense of this incredibly rich tapestry of history. When we're talking about the Barghest, when we're talking about the Red Cap, we are, of course, contemplating the possibility of deep paranormal realities, first of all, and then and individuals' experiences. But beyond that, we're talking, as you noted, in Yorkshire, and its relationship to the Barghest, and how history in Yorkshire may have contributed, or in some cases manifested, this death omen. That we're talking about a tragic and compelling tapestry of human experience that is easily 1,500, if not 2,000, if not ultimately perhaps even 3,000 years old, generation after generation, having these incredible and extraordinary and heartbreaking and devastating experiences of death and loss and attempt to regain territory, attempt to take territory, the individuals caught in the in between spaces of all of that, and it's very difficult to convey that in a 10-minute video.
It really is. And the flip side is it can also give the sense that really it's either superficial, or you now have the compendium of knowledge,
Yes.
and neither is accurate. And thought that just kind of came to mind is, and what your thought on it, the Barghest is an example. We're getting into territory of monsters that are at least representative of animals, and in the Ozarks, particularly early on, the use of monsters as, animals as, quote, monsters, so to speak, was really put to use in forming the image of the Ozarks, and particularly the Arkansas Ozarks.
Mm-hmm. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? And
Well, I think that there is something really powerful. We erroneously refer to North America as the New World. That's not accurate. And I believe that many of the first settlers to cross the Mississippi and come into Arkansas, to come into Missouri, to come into the Ozarks, were presented with certainly if they were able and willing to listen, they were presented with that tapestry. They were presented with that richness of depth of thousands of years of reality, thousands of years of story, of a type of narrative that was told, if not told to them in the tongues of First Nation peoples, it was told to them in the earth. It was told to them in the trees. It was told to them in the water, that there were things here. There was a past here that, much like, even in a more grand way, much like the Celts having this extraordinary past, but no written word to write it down. The first white settlers to come into the Ozarks were observing the realities of this extraordinary past, but without any books. There was no libraries. There were no books. In some cases, there were barely any people other than Osage raiding parties to say anything about this space. but we know that there were thousands of years of individuals living and dying with their own unique cultures and stories in these lands, and we don't know those. We don't know the words, but I think about the settlers coming into these spaces, um, into the spaces where back in those days you would have had a million stars visible at night over you. You would have had old growth, the original forests, which in many cases were pine. These grand stands of timber, the likes of which it's very difficult for us to wrap our heads around, and the depth of stories that were whispered in the roots and the water and the trees and the stone. That said, there were also those stories that were being embodied and encapsulated by animals, beasts, that beasties that in some cases for some of our early American forebears were of a type that had not been encountered before and were very terrifying in some cases. You think about especially early English colonists coming into the New World and coming from England, which certainly with its centuries of war and et cetera, certainly, and issues, certainly had its own set of complex dangers, but coming into a land that had, for example, rattlesnakes, cottonmouths. You get into a bit further south, alligators. You get into animals like bison. You get into bears. There's a mass compendium of animals that honestly we take for granted. We're not that freaked out by because we're accustomed to them, but these were in many cases alien beings for the people who were first coming into the region from Europe, and that in and of itself just engenders a sense of fear, a sense of wonder, possibly a sense of majesty, certainly a sense of introspection, and also a sense of how the heck do I survive this? Because there is no infrastructure to back me up if anything goes wrong.
Right. And then frankly, writers kind of reinforced that. And we don't think about that as far as how these kind of lore stories get going, but in the first half of the 1800s, particularly the 1830s to 1860s, popular broadsheets magazines, so to speak, of the time that we would equate to, our favorite TV shows today, probably, capitalized on the ruggedness of the area and these kind of stories. And the leading sort of sporting and hunting magazine of the day was actually the Spirit of the Times, and it was actually written by a fella. He was a newspaperman and lawyer from Batesville, Arkansas, which is kind of ironic because it was the most popular such magazine in the country, written in Arkansas, and he capitalized on the image of the wilderness and the beasties in Arkansas. And his name was Pete Whetstone, and he portrayed the area so well in that way that people avoided settling there for a longer period of time. And then another fellow, Thomas Thorpe, he was from Louisiana. He wrote a story, the Big Bear of Arkansas, and that story basically went viral as almost fan fiction of Whetstone's. And basically portrayed the hunting story about the largest bear that ever lived being in Arkansas. And they actually credit these kinds of stories with people settling in Arkansas later than surrounding states. So it's kind of interesting how those things happen. And so you still have wild animal lore, hogs, bears, mountain lions. You get a lot of that really, I think, goes back from this kind of tradition.
I definitely find it really, really fascinating. It is at a crucial moment in the development of the state of Arkansas, because we're just dealing with that time right prior and then after statehood, when it had reached the I think 50,000, a population of 50,000, I think, was the tipper to allow
I think so, yeah.
a state to be entered into the union. And the to me, it is really, really fascinating. It does deal heavily with beasts, as you already mentioned. We're talking about bear hunting. We're talking about wild hogs in particular, as well as panthers. Those are the big three. Whether they were as large as reported, whether they were as fierce as reported, etc., is specific to an anecdote and specific to an individual story. But there's a really fascinating push-pull from a sociocultural standpoint that is going on here as Arkansas is moving into statehood, because we have these outlandish stories, and I think to some degree it's fair to say that there are some basis. We're dealing with an extremely rugged frontier at this juncture point, and we're also dealing with a not contradictory, but I would say geography within conflict. We have very rugged mountains. We have some navigable river. We have a lot of natural resources that are suddenly available for exploitation. And then prior to things like river management and draining, we have an enormous amount of swampland and no effective cure for malaria. So there are a lot of factors going in. And I think from the 1840s into the 1860s, we see, you look at the war, you look at the Civil War in Arkansas, you look at some of the successful and then in some cases very unsuccessful riverboat expeditions and campaigns in association with Arkansas. You look at the differences between the fighting in lowland Arkansas and the flatland, the Delta, as opposed to fighting up in the mountains up here around Pea Ridge. We're dealing with very disparate regions that just happen to be in close proximity.
True. And it's sort of an aside that I find kind of amusing is that the sort of the voice of reason in all of these tales and these stories that got put out ultimately belong to none other than Albert Pike. Of trying to pull people off the ceiling and say no, Arkansas is not that wild, that dangerous, and here's the beauty of it. Considering other things he's known for, you're just not expecting that. But
well, Albert Pike being one of our favorite Ozarks adjacent personalities from the 19th century.
Yes. Well, I mean, he did live in Arkansas and actually taught school there, and darn near got killed there.
Mhm.
uh, and then went on to other notoriety that you don't have to get into.
Fair, fair. I'm Pike is one of my heroes that I hold at arm's length.
Yeah, he's a fascinating character. That there were admirable things that in his life, and other things you just kind of go, wait.
Oh, and something that on this overall subject that I do find particularly fascinating. We have this with these 19th century publications. We have this motif of Arkansas that has
Hmm.
developed.
Yeah.
Backwoods, bear hunting hillbillies.
Hmm.
And there, in some cases, these stories the origin of these stories are native, i.e., the individuals who are writing them are from Arkansas. They are in Arkansas. They have found a publication, a means of fame and comparative fortune through publication in this. And in other cases, the writers may only have been peripherally involved with Arkansas. Perhaps they passed through. Perhaps they were originally from Arkansas, but they moved to Chicago, and then begin publication, and it becomes its own. The at the time of printing, a contemporary folklore develops of
Hmm.
the nature of the state, and it is at once frontier-like and heroic, but at the same time, it can and often is extremely demeaning and stereotypical.
Yes, yes. I, I think more so to those outside the region, stereotyping, where I think in the region more of it was taken tongue in cheek, or could be. Um, Now, one aspect I wanted to touch on is that these tall tales and of early Arkansas and everything, they focus a lot on bears, hogs, and wild cats. Now, of course, bears are not uh, native in thousands of years to the British Isles,
Right.
etc. But uh, lore about monstrous cat beings actually are, something that comes out of lore from the Isles and the Celts.
Yes, it does. Goblin cats, witch cats, hell cats, not the F6F built by Grumman, 1942. The um, preceded by the Wildcat, preceded by
And
the
not the
Buffalo,
car.
and not the car. No, but this is something that dates back extraordinarily. Now we have endured the notoriety of the explosion and proliferation of fiery comments in regards to the existence or non-existence of large cats in the Ozarks, and particularly
Yep.
what color they may or may not be. I'll leave it at that. But
I vote for transparent. I think we should write about transparent cats next. Joking.
I'm okay with that. But it's there is something now. I think an interesting thing, just from a psychological, emotional, spiritual standpoint, there is something instantly evocative about the idea of a large supernatural cat.
It is. Certainly, phantom hounds certainly have that mystique, but I think with with these cats, it seems to be more almost a little more vicious version, if that's possible.
Agreed. And there is the certainly for anybody who's familiar with cats and has ever tried to tangle with one that wasn't happy, stuck in a box, needing a bath, needing to go to the vet, uh, these types of things. It
Pretty much
doesn't take,
anything he doesn't want to do.
yeah, it doesn't take very much cat to inflict an enormous amount of damage.
Yes. And then you take one that is very large and it is terrifying. But yes, and then also just the idea of witch cats too, I think is very interesting. Aside from the typical Halloween motif of a witch's familiar being a black cat, it's more innate than that. And in some ways, to me, the controversy about whether or not there could be Black Panthers in our midst is almost reminiscent of a witchy overtone, that it has to be, it cannot be, it's magical if it is. A little tongue in cheek there, but it's the idea of just the visceral reaction some people have to the notion
I
is
think
akin to saying you have a large witch cat.
it is, and I I feel that really brings up just an interesting observation because in a perhaps in a different dimensional timeline, uh, individuals would be having the conversation about whether or not Black Panthers existed in the Ozarks, and in a very reasoned sort of, well, they could be there, they might not be there, fine, whatever. That's not what happens. There
No.
are intense emotions and intense personal investment on both sides. Oftentimes, there are no animals of this nature in this region. Category are um, as zealous, if not more zealous, for their cause than the individuals who oftentimes are the folks, rural folks, farming folks, who are going, y'all can believe what you want to, but I know what I saw.
Exactly. Aside from accounts from law enforcement, etc.
Mm-hmm. And
So
there is a even, and I find this incredibly fascinating. I think it's an important motif in terms of observing human nature. Even when you strip uh, the traditions of religion out of something, you still find human beings acting religiously and zealously for a cause that they believe in.
that's true. And ironically, most of the people with such strong opinions don't seem to have a personal stake in the matter either. Or even as personal experience, um, which I find a little baffling. But
And I also, and this comes back to our, many of the individuals who've reached out to Dark Ozarks, et cetera, or commented, and we've, opened up dialogue through the page, that a lot of everyday folks who are being argued with in regards to the existence of, and I'll just say it, the existence of Black Panthers in the Ozarks, the folks who've seen them, they're not dissimilar to the individuals that we've talked to who have had paranormal experiences, genuine, incredible paranormal experiences. They're like, I didn't care until it happened to me. I'm not trying to argue with anyone. I'm just telling you what I experienced, or I'm just telling you what I saw.
Exactly, exactly. Um, and I think it's a good illustration of, if anyone's confused by why there's such a rich history of lore, particularly in Scotland, of witch cats, just that process of that dialogue makes it understandable of how you end up with lore like that. You that you have a very real creature that is very dangerous, that can be very vicious on a level that other animal attacks do not have the same level of uh, mutilation, etc., and ascribing something more than a corporeal animal to it, uh, as being extremely unsettling, even more so. And watching the debate about panthers in the Ozarks, I can see, I can just imagine how all of lore developed over time in the past regarding large cats and witches and so forth, um, because it is rather amazing.
It is, and I think that on a sort of a psychosocial quality, there is a lot of momentum and a lot of force, and likely from an aspect of genetic memory or ancestral memory, there is a lot of momentum in the whole in this entire genre.
That's true. I think you hit the nail on the head there.
I
Let's see.
I am I'm personally fascinated by witch cat stories and
Me
just
too.
that conflation. It is also interesting just putting yourself into the mindset, just a little bit of the mindset. Your what's the word for it? Your many so first of all, many of the settlers coming into the Ozarks were Scotch Irish,
Hmm.
and they were coming from with an incredibly rich tradition of witch cats
Yeah.
and witch cat lore, as well as wards against witch cats and understanding of witch cats as shifters and all of these things. And they're coming into a region that, unlike Scotland and Northern Ireland, which had cats but did not have large cats, they are suddenly coming into a region. You can debate the melanistic color or non-melanistic color all you want to, but they are coming into a region in which there were very large cats living and hunting.
So yes, so if domesticated size cats are an issue, now one that's 5 times their size or so, oh my, I can, yeah, I agree with you. I can see that. And you brought up a point too there, that it's the shifter aspect of it. I wanted to go into a little more, as far as there are a lot of tales in the Ozarks actually that fall into that category. Um, and actually, I think more over time, there seem to be more occurring now than even in, 150, 200 years ago, it seems. And it's in part kind of, it comes out of this tradition. It also comes out of Native American traditions, but you have um, lore and experiences that are being brought to us, etc., involving shape shifting, whether it is a human form or a human appearance with animal characteristics, or shifting between a human form and an animal form. Um, and sometimes it's related to magic and sometimes not as clearly. Uh, and I find that interesting. I find it interesting that there seems to be more accounts of it now than in the past. What are your thoughts?
I think that one is complicated. I think one of the things we have established is that there's an enormous amount of ancestral memory that even outweighs ancestral lore. And first of all, I think it's incredibly powerful. Uh, it's difficult to track because, but it is something that seems to happen where even if the lore is lost, if the stories are lost over a generation, that the somehow the gravitas or the importance of a thing continues to resonate in the following generations. And so someone, for example, of Scottish or Irish or Scots-Irish ancestry, who might not even know that they have that ancestry, could be exposed to a thing and somehow say, I don't understand why, but this is incredibly important to me. I am personally invested in the thing, and I can't explain why. And it
That's
could be,
that's true. And then bumping up against Native American lore that has similar characteristics.
yes, it does.
Um, and I think in that kind of situation, the lore from both traditions kind of validates the other as far as, oh, this type of thing is not just unique in one tradition or another, and so it gives it more credence, I think, as far as okay, there's something to it.
Yes. And the way I tend to see this, or I'm seeing this at the moment, is like looking into a reflection of the past, but the glass is shattered. You see all of these different fragments and bits and pieces, and certain things that you see may feel very important. Other things may simply not make any sense. Um, Usually, a great place to go is into the original lore, if at all possible, finding the original documentation. That's certainly a lot easier to do with our European ancestry because of places like Trinity College, etc. That there's documented bits and pieces that really do go deep, but in the case of individuals with Native American ancestry, connecting with your tribe, learning your tribe's history, connecting, going to for example, in many cases around here, finding where your tribe is headquartered in Oklahoma, talking to individuals who have made it their vested interest to learn and preserve the language, to learn and preserve the customs, the cultures, and learn the history and understand the history. All of these things are very, very important in the process to see and find what resonates, because a lot of times a thing will resonate and we subconsciously or even unconsciously associate it. We know it's important. There's something about the thing. It might be a theme, it might be an image, it might be a bit of song that we just innately connect with. And we don't know why. And I think in many cases it is that ancestral memory. It is that connection with our past and our past thousands of generations past. And we know it's important, but we can't explain why. It's also within that space really easy, especially with the internet, to just get, again, those fragments, those pieces, and we might associate ourselves with that, but not fully be able to contextualize the association. And so we're suddenly, in essence, basing our personality off of a very fragmented image, and we become very personally invested and in some cases hostile in terms of defending something that we don't fully understand.
I think that's a fair assessment. Um,
Personal experience. I've only done it like repeatedly.
What a surprise.
Yeah, once or twice. Mostly with my Celtic ancestry.
um, I don't know about you. I want to talk about headless horsemen.
It's always a fun topic.
It is.
Headless phantom beasts of any kind are incredibly fun. The the reality that we can tie this back to the Dullahan is
Mhm.
fascinating to me.
Yes, um, and again, it headlessness is death omen. Also, a lot of shades of the banshee, or similarities. But what I find it's interesting that the Dullahan has more control over who dies, I think, or picking and choosing. Um, and it really is the genesis of Sleepy Hollow, which everyone's familiar with.
And I love it. So I'm gonna brag on myself for just a moment because that's the thing I do. I am very proud of the fact that I've been a fan of the Dullahan for probably close to 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
The Dullahan is a bit more commonplace on the internet today than it was 25 years ago. So let's just say I dug pretty deep to find Dullahan lore in the late 90s, early 2000s, and succeeded. There is something very, certainly very spectral and powerful and malevolent and terrifying and resonant about the image of the Dullahan, even before you know his origins, because the Dullahan is, and I find this interesting. Technically, the Dullahan is a fairy,
Mm-hmm.
and that for people who are not familiar with the broad realities of Irish fairyland, they are not prepared for something like the Dullahan. He's a headless rider on a black horse, carrying his own head under his arm.
Which in the head is basically how he guides himself because he can see. Um, and uses a human spine as a whip,
Yeah.
dragging a wagon in some versions, that is full of, it's basically a funeral wagon, um, with candles and skulls, and both of the wheels are made from thigh bones and covered with worm chewed pall or dried human skin. Um, you know him when he's coming, so to speak.
Yes, yes, you do. And and this is over certainly the coach aspect, the coach de bar, the aspect of the Dullahan is, in my opinion, something that began to really be developed in the 16th, 17th centuries in Ireland.
Mhm.
And at the time would have been a contemporary retelling. But when you begin to wrap your head around the fact that the Dullahan is also considered to be the embodiment of Crom Duv, the Celtic god of death.
Yes.
The gravitas of this being takes an extraordinary turn.
Yes. Well, in some ways, he reminds me of the Baron in Voodoo. Um,
Agreed. Agreed.
and
Because he is,
a
he's
lot of similar.
he
Oh, go ahead.
functions he functions as the ferryman.
Yes. Yes. Um, and you do have to wonder if the added elements with the coach and sort of that very grotesque adornments really didn't come out of the Black Plague, the Black Death.
Certainly, it's possible. I think
Yeah.
there to
Motifs
me
were very common.
it is there are interesting qualities to this, because there obviously by the 1600s 1700s, beginning in places, in not beginning in places, the English influence, the British influence in Ireland, in Dublin and Waterford, etc., making these cities into, at the time, contemporary modern English cities, with the trappings thereof, and the carriages, and the death customs, and all of that. But although we do not have archaeological evidence of chariots in Ireland, we do have an incredibly rich body of lore associated with war chariots, horse-drawn wagons of sort, that were associated with the great epic cycles, and consequently, by attachment, associated with the gods. And so, to me, it's interesting qualities that are all feeding into this, of a great the mythological embodiment of death, and something on wheels.
Yes. Yes. Agreed. And ironically, and of course, it also, the headlessness to me is also symbolic of the Celts more generally, because they were known to decapitate their enemies, and a veneration of the severed head.
Yes, the extraordinary focus on the severed head in traditional Celtic belief structures, that both as an act of war, and then also veneration of one's ancestors, that again speaks to the dual nature and the duality of the Celtic cosmology. And I think now would be just a good time to insert, just for a moment, the ancient gods of the Celts in the British Isles as the overarching influence of Christianity spread. Those gods shifted in terms of the people, the everyday people. For example, of Ireland, we'll just speak on Ireland specifically in this case. The people of Ireland adopted Christianity, but they did not throw away the old gods. The old gods changed, and they are referred to as the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu. They are referred to as the good people, the fair folk, the Fae, and they are the lesser known Irish mythology, of which we, to a degree, only have bits and pieces of through the cycles. We have more than we think we have, because the ancient gods are what later become the fairy tales.
Yes, in a large sense, that's very true. It's just a matter of retelling in different ways. And they are very much with us, and they are very much with the idea of the headless phantom, and the headless specter is with us in the Ozarks as well.
It is in many locations. One just over here on Highway 13. There's an old legend of a headless man who walks old Highway 13. But as was noted, he walked Highway 13 before they changed Highway 13. So the new grades in the road may have meant that he went elsewhere, or that he's walking in an area that isn't a road now.
exactly, or at least not visible from the road. Um,
Mhm.
and there's several reasons aside from just the settlers bringing lore. Um, the Osage, who were the dominant Native American tribe in the region, often decapitated their enemies. We're so used to Western movies and TV giving us that scalping was the trophy of choice, but not necessarily. And the Osage were wont to leave heads in a pile as warnings as well. So,
Works.
it, which is worse, but also very akin to ancient Celtic practices, as we have been told.
Oh,
Um,
it is. It is, which I really find rather endearing.
yeah. Okay, remind me not to fall asleep accidentally around. Um,
FYI, I'm creepier than I look. Um, Speaking of the momentum of my genetic memory, or ancestral memory, it is. Oh, but
but
there is something about a pile of severed heads or a head on a pike that definitely gets one's attention, and really sends a very clear message to one's
yes,
opposition.
yes, and in the Ozarks, that has occurred various times, but prominently again during the Civil War, um, and not just by those Native Americans fighting. Um, there were a number of soldiers on both sides that would decapitate. Um, and but and there's several stories of that. There's the headless phantom that roams outside Humansville, um, that is supposed to be of a unknown, unidentified soldier. There is the headless phantom in Avila,
Yes,
which whose story is much akin to the head on the pike on London Bridge as anything else.
it is.
Um, in that circumstance, the town militia, who Avila was pro-union, although there were a number of slaveholders there. They advocated staying in the union, and they've been attacked so many times by bushwhackers that they formulated a plan to protect the town that was offensive rather than defensive, as was often used up to that point. And ultimately, their self-defense plan was adopted throughout Missouri during the war.
Right.
And basically, they went out and hunted bushwhackers. And in this particular instance, they came across the decomposing body of a bushwhacker that apparently they had shot and not realized at some point, and as a warning, hung his head from either an apple tree or Osage orange tree along the road entering town as a warning to other bushwhackers.
Correct. That and a warning like that does send a very clear message.
It really does. A rotting skull does tend to send a message. And
And
then I go, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, what throughout the world, and certainly at the time of Halloween, as well as Dia de los Muertos, that the image of the skull is just it is a incredibly powerful motif,
It
and
is.
it's obviously it speaks to our mortality. It I suppose it's, it's the one part of our skeletal structure that most closely resembles us and life. There is something innately attracting, but also repulsive and frightening and interesting and compelling all at once with the
Yeah,
imagery of the skull.
very true. And just the, using the phrase imagery of the skull made me think of Dead Man's Pond in Stone
Yes.
County, where, again, townsfolk ambushed bushwhackers who had stolen cattle after they had killed several men in town in Galena, Missouri. And the bushwhackers had camped at the pond that became known as Dead Man's Pond, and they slaughtered them to the last man. And the story went that the bodies were rolled into the pond, and over time, skulls were, basically would either appear or were dredged up. But I always find it interesting. I've yet to hear a rendering of the story that said other bones were found.
Right.
It's
It
always
was,
just the skulls,
it's the skull. And
which which makes you wonder if they were beheaded at the time.
well, that does bring up a good question. Um, or the skulls were just the most creepy and iconic, and they managed to make it into the story. But either way, it is a powerful aspect, and of course, there's a lot of hauntings associated with Dead Man's Pond.
Yes, and understandably so.
Oh yeah,
But it does make you wonder. Certainly does have that headless motif to the story, almost to a fault. Um, let's see. Could talk about vampires.
vampires are always fun, unless of course you're a victim of the vampires, and it's less fun. Now, here's an aspect that I do find really interesting. Well, it's kind of, I was going to say draw a line, but it's more of a complex yarn diagram stretching from location to location and sometimes intersecting, because vampires, vampire mythology, vampire lore, all of this it is beyond monolithic in modern culture. It is instantly recognizable in the 20th century and 20th and now 21st century cinema. It is just extraordinarily massive, and so much so that certain names are just associated with vampire mythology, even as a modern myth. Um, Names like Anne Rice, uh, Lestat, Bela Lugosi, um, honestly, Christopher Lee. These are, Hammer horror films. All of this ties together. I'm expressly not mentioning a couple, but the progenitor of all of this is Bram Stoker, and Bram is, of course, cited his sources with the Romanian Vlad the Impaler as its origin, and there's an enormous amount of focus on that. But Stoker was Irish and Scottish folklore contain what, although they're not called vampires, contain a very rich lore of vampiric-like fae, or vampiric death spirits, that, spirits of the dead as opposed to spirits of the fae, that in some cases are not that dissimilar from Deer Woman.
True, very true. Had not thought of that, but that's true. Of thinking of the dear Jew, I take it.
Yeah, the Derdu and the Avatach.
Yeah.
There's these well there's a couple. We've got there are some claims that the Avatach in Irish folklore, quote unquote, a chieftain dwarf who could not be killed. He would come up from his grave every night, drink the blood of his enemies, and no matter how many times he got killed, he'd just show back up. It's like a recurring nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
He the only way to kill the Avarthach was with a sword made of yew wood. And that is really interesting in and of itself. Obviously, it's basically a wooden stake, but
Mm-hmm.
the yew, for those of you who are confused, it's YEU, has an extraordinary history as a magical tree, not
Yeah,
dissimilar to the hawthorn.
true. So I mean, it's um, so that magical power ostensibly would be what made using it different than another means of killing him, so that he wasn't resurrected. Um, but again, it just very similar to the idea of the wooden stake, um, and that also that he was buried upside down, had
Right.
to be buried upside down, which often in medieval graves that they find evidence that someone was killed or thought to be a vampire. One of the sort of precautions taken would often be to bury the person upside down.
Correct. Correct. And going over to the Derek Do, there is that crossover with Dear Woman. In this case, this is a young woman who is um, horribly abused by the man that she is given to
Mm-hmm.
as a husband, not the man that she wants to marry, the man that her father forces her to marry. He
Mm-hmm.
and when in really now this is a very dark but interesting story to me. Obviously, it speaks of the some of the darkest aspects of domestic abuse, but
Mm-hmm.
we're if you just strictly follow the lines of the story, we're dealing with a rich aristocracy who takes a poor girl as his wife and then forces her to submit to ritualistic abuse because he's draining
Yes.
her blood. And that is a common motif that resonates throughout the story because ultimately he kills her.
Yes. Which again is a motif that is used time and again in vampire fiction and movies, etc.
It is. But in this case, and to me, this really speaks of the um, dark mischievousness and the turn of fate that you see uh, in the Tuatha De Danann,
Mm-hmm.
because it is certainly implied that the husband is mortal. He's doing horrible things, but he's mortal. His young
Mm-hmm.
wife dies. He is already off with these other women. She is buried in a pauper's grave. Her family doesn't care because they got paid.
Yeah.
There's some really, really horrible aspect to this story. And then she returns as the Derek and seeks her revenge first on her father and then on her husband.
Mm-hmm. And then it's balanced with that. Yeah, she comes back with revenge, but in part of the telling of the story is, ironically, that her lost love actually is loyal to her, visits her grave every day, professes his love, and praying for her return. But that, unfortunately, is not what she responded to. She responded to the revenge, which, of course, delves into the darker aspects of vampire lore.
It does. And there, to me, there's something very obviously there's a really satisfying aspect of vengeance and justice, vigilante justice, in essence, in this case. Um, there is lore in the idea that if you don't want a person like this to come back, you pile stones on their grave.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a couple of different turns of this particular story. One was that she's the first Dark Ozarks, and so they didn't know to pile stones on her grave. Now that does
Right.
imply the possibility that this could happen again with different people.
Mm-hmm.
So that's creepy. But there is also a twist in the fact that they did pile the stones, and her lover removes the stones to allow her to return.
Yes. That basically his love blinded him to the
Yeah,
reality of what she had become. Yes.
and
Um,
and then she forms an insatiable desire for blood.
yes. And then pretty much we are full blown vampire lore.
Just we are. We have arrived. And also the fact that there's not really a conclusion to the story after she uh, seeks her revenge. She enjoyed blood so much that she really just goes on an interminable hunt,
Yes.
and to
And
which theoretically continued to this day.
exactly. Which again just it is rife with modern vampire lore of the, these eternal beings and existing basically forever. And so it does make you wonder if nothing else, that Stoker didn't have the seeds of the idea from these tales. And then, of course, finding Vlad the Impaler and Romania just made it more mysterious for his English audience. And I think in a way, I think one reason that Stoker's version has endured is because he did use real places. He used elements of reality that I think became very intriguing for people because it made it feel like it's more plausible. And I
It
think that's
does.
part of the genius of his telling and why it's still the standard.
I very much concur with that because it does feel grounded in the reality of the age.
Exactly. And so I think it's very likely that these stories were the initial uh, impetus, but through research, because he spent years actually researching it before, and writing it. It was like 7-8 years. So, he found the perfect, combination of facts and lore to create the story. Um,
I can that makes me feel better about the amount of time that it takes for me to write a novel.
you and me both. Um, as I have one sitting that I've been working on for years. Um, but again, for our Ozarks connection, there's vampire lore in the Ozarks. I mean, there's even in the internet age, you can find it related to Springfield and supposedly in the tunnels of Jordan Creek in downtown Springfield. Um, and there certainly are credible firsthand accounts of odd things that go on there, of a either a ritualistic or at least an organized basis. But, and we've told this on a video in the past, there is a lore of a vampire buried in a cemetery in, I believe, Phelps County, that was I believe a coal miner, and he was an albino, which of course feeds into, you know, one of the urban legend motifs. But he really was an albino and a miner, and but the lore has grown up that he was a vampire.
It has, and there's, I believe, if memory serves, that's the uh the cemetery with the cage.
Yes, there is a cage, and all kinds of stories come up around those kinds of graves that ultimately they serve two purposes. One was just to deter looters, and the second was to deter reanimators, you know, so that the body wouldn't be taken to, you know, medical school to be dissected. We're looking at you, Professor McDowell.
Yeah. Yeah, and the grotesque nature of that bit of history, when that the remnants of that history get presented onto the internet without context, it is very easy for individuals to erroneously jump to the conclusion, oh my gosh, the cage is there to keep somebody in. It must be a witch's grave. It must be a vampire's grave. It must be this. It must be that. No, it's there to keep looters out.
Yeah, to protect the grave. Yeah.
To simply protect the grave. And sometimes that is a little disappointing to people because they really wanted it to be the thing. And I think psychologically we see these things and we think we're the only one who's ever found it, and we want ourselves to be the person to have discovered the mystery of the vampire, or you know, whatever. And I think we see something similar with the obsession over purported witches' graves throughout the Ozarks.
Mm-hmm.
And
agreed. And you get that in a lot of places, but I think it's just sort of that almost forbidden subject titillation factor on witches' graves, because usually the reason they identify a grave as a witch's grave is pretty mundane, usually.
Right. Usually a bit of inscription that to our modern eyes seems somehow mystical, or we might think of it as a spell, but in the 19th century was actually a very common Victorian era inscription to invite the cemetery goer, or the graveyard goer, to be introspective and to contemplate building a better life now rather than the hereafter.
Yes, and that, even the idea of inviting them to do that seems a little askance now, but at the time, people spent time in cemeteries, had picnics in cemeteries. They were a place of introspection and reflection. So, I mean, it made perfect sense at the time.
And a place to eat your fried chicken and let the kids play.
That's right. Let's go visit grandma and have fried chicken.
Yeah, and it's in our incredibly modern world that we just like to pat ourselves on the back that we're so contextually developed. We're you know, don't realize that we've been heavily influenced by 40 years of horror movies instead of a long ancestral past of respect.
Exactly. You know, one thing I want to touch on that is a little askance, but from the lore, but maybe not, are giant birds.
Yes.
And flying humanoids. You know,
I'm quite fascinated by both.
there apparently there is and I don't know a lot about it in the materials, reference to tale out of basically Texas and Howell County, Missouri, of giant birds, the giganticus, 6-foot birds, which seems to be a bit of a tall tale. But certainly there, could have been a rather large bird. And I don't know if you see a vulture up close, they certainly can have a wingspan of that or more. So I found that interesting. Then the late 20th century it's a pterosaur stories.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I wonder if the idea of the pterosaur comes out of the fascination with dinosaurs, which became very prevalent in mid 20th century, or is it somehow a refashioning of Phoenix stories?
Phoenix stories or Thunderbird lore.
Or Thunderbird, yeah.
There's a lot tying into this, and of course the lore about pterosaurs or pterodactyls is its own cryptid genre.
Mm-hmm.
Both here, interestingly enough, sightings in what is interestingly our specific parallel latitude that seems to be a long running stretch of weirdness.
The 38th parallel, yes. Which runs right through the northern Ozarks.
Yes. And they're from UFO sightings to Bigfoot sightings to pterodactyl rumors to weird things. And certainly there's the tie-in with the Native American lore of the Thunderbird. And I'm going to throw the Piasa bird in there as well. I mean,
I think so.
There's some interesting tie-in. What we do know is that the Mississippian / Cahokian mound builder people did share ties with Middle American, Mesoamerican, Central American peoples, and so we can draw some comparisons there, and certainly from Thunderbird lore of the Great Plains to the feathered winged serpent Quetzalcoatl to other Mesoamerican deities that were associated with the sky. These sky god, sky animal motifs are extremely powerful, and powerful enough that whether we understand the ancient culture or not, they do resonate with us. Yes. on a very visceral level.
Well, I think so. I mean, and you mentioned the Piazza bird at the Mississippi, and just contemplating what all happened for them to put the painting on the cliff. Right. That process resonates. So it does make you wonder what it is about this motif, other than it's kind of like the big cats. I mean, it's something very out of the ordinary, potentially very dangerous, could pick you up and fly off with you, a kind of danger that is totally unsettling.
It is, and I would say archetypal as well.
Yes. But I find it also interesting that it's kind of morphed, and again, it kind of goes not entirely just with the internet age and with the internet, but say in the last 20 to 30 years, we've developed two things. One is a motif of, now it's not just a huge bird, but a flying humanoid.
Correct.
And you started getting these accounts actually over large cities
Yes.
to begin with. And Chicago comes to mind, but Chicago may have been one of the first places, but you had a lot of them where people would spot what looked like a flying man, sometimes with wings, sometimes not. And then there have been accounts even in Kansas City, the Kansas City area, the St. Louis area. We're getting, again, we're kind of coming down towards the 38th parallel. There's been accounts, actually, one account that I heard, but I've never been able to track down the original source, supposedly out of the Joplin area. There's one out of the Branson area. And I just find it interesting, and particularly the ones where they're winged. The other prong of this is sort of the Mothman motif, which starts in the 60s at Pleasant, West Virginia. And that has, sort of a definite origin story. But it's not necessarily purely humanoid, but similar type of experience. And that type of creature has been reported elsewhere as well. I kind of wonder, are our encounters with whatever large flying things are out there potentially now being clouded by our media driven idea of monsters?
I would say yes. I think that's a fair conjecture that that certainly the power of Mothman has reached across the nation, if not further than that, and reached a long ways from 1966 in Pleasant Point, West Virginia. That at the same time, that doesn't, the existence of the fact that we as human beings are able to absorb elements of pop culture and then in some way, shape, or form inadvertently reconstitute it in our own fiction, and sometimes believe our own fiction, does not take away from the reality that some of this phenomena also appears to be occurring separately.
Yes, I mean, I think it's, potentially fair to say that, some of these at least may be something large in the sky, whatever it is.
Mhm.
And as far as I know, California condors haven't migrated to the middle of the continent, so I'm not sure.
That we know of. It is odd to say the least. The story from a flying humanoid outside of Branson, for me, was particularly fascinating. It's documented on ultimateunexplained.com. And what especially caught my eye is that the individuals who say that they saw this, their video is on YouTube. It was featured on Destination America, and as they tell it, they journeyed into the woods near Turkey Creek outside of Branson, which is a mile from my house.
Right. And ironically, I've heard the same version of this story happening supposedly happening at Turkey Creek in Joplin.
There's now, for people who are unfamiliar, there are a number of Turkey Creeks in the Ozarks.
Yes.
So it does.
So it makes you wonder, is it the same event being told is happening in other places or not? I don't know.
And I don't either. And this is probably based just on our time. This is probably our last one to cover for this episode. But the article mentions several individuals they sharing that they went into the woods near Turkey Creek. I love the description. It's a stream in the Missouri Ozarks that extends down into Arkansas. The guys found a strange cave, and shortly afterward, they heard sounds in the trees. It was a whooshing sound that brought them face to face with a winged creature that looked half human, half bird. One man said it sounded almost like a freight train, and of course it did, and was coming straight at them. As they fled, the creature also relented. Interesting choice of words. And if you check out the article itself, there's even a YouTube video reenacting their experience, which I watched.
You watched? I did not. I didn't get that part.
It's only a few minutes long. I recommend watching it. And interestingly enough, the individuals playing the people in the article are actually the people in the article playing themselves, reenacting all of it.
Interesting.
Yes, okay. The play's the thing. So it's I am personally fascinated. I'm on one hand, I find the article, this particular bit of information, really bemusing because it's in my own backyard, and I guarantee you could poll pretty much everybody other than me after this afternoon in the Turkey Creek community, and nobody would know what we're talking about.
That's probably accurate. But here's my theory. I think someone has a jetpack. and they're playing pranks, and apparently all over southern Missouri, and I've heard this version, a similar version, of the Kansas City area in St. Louis. So someone's getting around with a jetpack is my personal theory, and I want one, but
I do too, with one caveat, and that is that I get a bird suit to go with it.
Someone might shoot you.
And probably for good reason.
Well, that is a dive into some of the monster lore, and the irony there is that there's quite a bit more.
Yes, there is. But I'm proposing a part 2 a little bit later in the season.
I think we can definitely do that. In the meantime, don't forget to check out upcoming events and merchandise at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com, and stay tuned for an announcement on darkozarks.com for something coming soon. Thank you again to Always Buying Books and Beard Engine Brewing Company for helping to bring the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
On the next episode, we are going to be discussing seances and spiritualism. Catch the Dark Ozarks podcast on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, Substack, or just about any podcast platform. Thank you, everyone. And remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.